The lights inside the council chamber of Alphanar Prime flickered the way they always did when too many species talked at once. Over 400 delegations sat in their curved seats, arguing about trade routes and border lines and who owed what to whom. It was the same noise it had been for centuries, and somewhere near the back of the chamber, in a row of seats that nobody ever looked at twice, the human delegation sat quietly and listened. They had always listened. Nathan Cole didn't care much for politics. He was a captain, not a diplomat, and the bridge of his deep space frigate, the Starling, was the only place he ever felt like he was doing something that mattered. He stood near the viewport now, watching the stars drift by as the ship cut through the dark space between systems. Behind him, his second-in-command, Megan Pratt, was going over the mission briefing on her datapad. And down in the engine room, Danny Garzo was singing something off-key while he ran diagnostics on the reactor coils. They were heading to a Draelith colony world. Again. The colony's main reactor had been failing for months, and the Draelith government had sent a request through the Galactic Concord for engineering assistance. The request had bounced around for weeks before it landed, as it always did, on a human ship. No one else had volunteered. No one else ever did. Nathan had stopped feeling bitter about it a long time ago. Bitterness required energy, and energy was something he couldn't afford to waste. He just did the work, filed his reports, and moved on to the next job. The Starling arrived at the colony 3 days later. The reactor was worse than the briefing had described. Danny took one look at the core housing and let out a long, low whistle. "They've been running this thing without coolant cycling for at least 6 months, he said, pulling on his gloves. "It's a miracle the whole thing hasn't gone critical." It took Danny and his team 4 days to stabilize the reactor, and another 2 to install temporary replacement parts from the Starling's own supplies. Parts they would have to replace out of their own budget when they got back to port. Nathan made sure the crew stayed professional the entire time. They smiled at the Draelith workers. They answered questions. They shared meals when invited, and cleaned up after themselves when they were done. On the last day, Nathan went to the colonial governor's office to file the completion report. The governor, a tall Draelith with deep green scales and an expression that never changed, accepted the report without looking at it. He did not say thank you. He did not offer to reimburse the parts. Instead, he told Nathan that he would be filing a formal complaint with the Concord, claiming that the human crew had exceeded their operational mandate by accessing restricted sections of the colony's infrastructure. Nathan stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, turned around, and walked back to his ship. Megan was waiting at the airlock. She could read his face the way she read sensor data, quickly and accurately. "How bad?" she asked. "Complaint filed," Nathan said. "Overreach of mandate." Megan's jaw tightened. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. 12,000 light-years away, on a quiet floor of a building in Geneva that most people on Earth didn't even know existed, a woman named Laura Bishop sat behind a desk, covered in files. She had been the Secretary of Interstellar Affairs for exactly 47 days, and in that time, she had read more classified documents than she had in her entire previous career combined. The dossier in front of her was thick. It had no title on the cover, just a serial number and a classification stamp. Inside, it contained 10 years of records. Every insult delivered to a human diplomat on the Concord floor. Every trade route application denied without reason. Every colony permit blocked by species who already owned more territory than they could use. Every emergency mission completed by human crews without recognition, payment, or thanks. Every broken promise. Every quiet betrayal. Laura had started reading it with professional detachment. By page 40, her hands were shaking. She brought the dossier to President Kevin Marsh the following morning. Kevin was a calm man, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, and he read through the summary in silence, while Laura sat across from him. Also in the room were General Pete Salinas, who oversaw Earth's defense fleet, and Audrey Nolan, who had spent 20 years as a diplomatic strategist before most people knew what that job even meant. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody slammed a fist on the table. The room was very still. "How long has it been like this?" Kevin asked. "Since the beginning," Laura said. "Since the day we joined the Concorde. We just didn't keep count, until now." Kevin set the dossier down. He looked at Pete. He looked at Audrey. Then he looked at Laura. "What are our options?" he asked. Audrey was the one who answered. "We've tried negotiation. We've tried patience. We've tried proving ourselves. None of it has worked, because the galaxy doesn't see us as partners. They see us as tools. And tools don't get a seat at the table." "So what do we do?" Kevin asked. "We stop being useful," Audrey said. The room was quiet again. Kevin turned to the window. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy with rain. He watched it for a long time. "Draft the order," he said. The executive order was called Quiet Dawn. It was 3 pages long. It contained no threats, no accusations, and no demands. It simply authorized the full silent withdrawal of all human personnel, resources, and infrastructure from galactic space. Every ship would come home. Every base would power down. Every doctor, engineer, teacher, and soldier serving on alien worlds would pack their things and leave. There would be no press conference, no farewell speech, no explanation. Across human-occupied space, the order went out on secured channels. Captains read it and passed it to their crews. Engineers shut down equipment they had spent years building. Doctors said goodbye to patients who didn't understand why they were leaving. Soldiers folded their uniforms and boarded transports heading sunward. Nathan Cole received the order while the Starling was still 2 days out from the nearest human port. He read it on his personal terminal, alone in his quarters. Then he read it again. He sat with it for a while, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not sadness, but something heavier and older than both. He walked to the bridge. Megan looked up from her console. "New orders," Nathan said. His voice was steady. "Set course for home." Megan studied his face. She didn't ask questions. She entered the coordinates. The Starling turned toward Earth, and behind it, the galaxy continued to spin, unaware that the people who had been quietly holding it together had just decided to let go. 3 months passed, and the galaxy didn't notice. That was the thing about humans. They had always been so quiet about the work they did that when they stopped doing it, the silence sounded exactly the same. No alarms went off. No emergency sessions were called. The Concorde continued its endless debates about tariffs and territorial claims, and the empty chairs where the human delegation used to sit gathered a thin layer of dust that the cleaning drones missed because no one had told them to look there. The first sign of trouble came from the edges, the way it always does. A Vayari cargo hauler named the Tessran lost engine power in the Korath Expanse, a stretch of space that most species avoided if they could help it. The region was full of asteroid fields, dead signal zones, and raiders who knew both of those things very well. The Tessran's captain sent out a distress signal on all standard frequencies and waited. In the old days, a human patrol ship would have responded within hours. The humans kept a network of fast-response frigates scattered across the major shipping lanes, crewed by people like Nathan Cole, who didn't sleep much and didn't complain about the pay. They were always there. Everyone knew they were there, even if nobody talked about it. But the signal bounced for 6 days. No human ship answered. No human tow vessel appeared on the long-range sensors. The Tessran drifted, and on the 3rd day, scavengers found it. They stripped half the cargo before a passing merchant vessel scared them off and towed the Tessran to the nearest station. The Vayari Trade Guild filed a complaint with the Concord about the lack of patrol coverage in the Korath Expanse. The complaint was noted, assigned a case number, and placed in a queue behind 400 other complaints. Nobody connected it to the empty chairs. On the Concord floor, Ambassador Thylin Rask of the Solhari Dominion noticed the chairs. Rask was older than most of his colleagues and sharper than nearly all of them. He had served on the Concord for 32 years, and in that time, he had watched the humans more carefully than anyone else in the chamber. Not because he liked them or disliked them, but because he found them interesting. They were the only species he had ever seen that did more than they were asked to do and expected less than they deserved in return. He raised a procedural question during a session on agricultural subsidies. "Has anyone heard from the human delegation?" he asked. "Their seats have been empty for several weeks." The chamber murmured. A few delegates glanced toward the back. Someone from the Kellis Reach Coalition suggested that the humans were probably busy with some internal matter, and would return shortly. The session moved on. Rask didn't move on. He went back to his office and started pulling records. On Earth, the world was changing, but it was changing quietly, the same way the withdrawal had been carried out. The resources that had once flowed outward, the ships, the engineers, the medical teams, the emergency funds, were being redirected inward. Shipyards that had built vessels for galactic service were now building for Earth's own fleet. Research labs that had shared their findings freely with the Concord were now keeping their work classified. Danny Garza was reassigned to a lunar shipyard called Copernicus Station, where he joined a team working on a new generation of drive cores. The work was good, the pay was better, and for the first time in years, nobody filed a complaint when he did his job well. Megan Pratt took command of a border monitoring station on the outer edge of the solar system. It was quiet work, watching the deep space sensors and logging the occasional passing freighter. She liked it. She had spent so many years in crisis mode that the silence felt like a gift she didn't know she needed. Laura Bishop oversaw the withdrawal from her office in Geneva with the same calm precision she brought to everything. 200 off-world outposts were dismantled over the course of those 3 months. Every piece of human technology was either removed or deactivated. Every contract was honored to its expiration date, and not one day beyond. Everything was done by the book, because Laura understood that the only thing more powerful than leaving was leaving without giving anyone a reason to call you unprofessional. In the galaxy, things got worse slowly, and then, all at once. The Rithan Collective had 12 colony worlds that depended on water purification systems designed and built by human engineers. The systems were robust, but they needed maintenance, and the maintenance manuals were written in human technical language that no one else had bothered to learn. When the first filters began to fail, the Rithan sent requests to the Concord for replacement parts. The Concord checked its databases and found that the parts were human-manufactured and not available through any galactic supplier. The Rithan tried to build their own. The replacements didn't fit. They tried to modify the originals. The modifications caused pressure failures. Within 2 months, 3 colonies were rationing water. On the Kellis Reach, a network of agricultural monitoring stations went dark. These stations had been built and maintained by human volunteers, agronomists and engineers who had spent years living among the Kellis people, learning their soil chemistry and crop cycles, and building systems tailored to their specific needs. Without the humans to maintain them, the stations failed one by one, like lights going out along a road. The Kellis Reach lost 3 consecutive harvests. Millions went hungry. The Drelith governor who had filed the complaint against Nathan Cole found himself standing in front of his colony's reactor again. It was failing. The temporary repairs Danny Garza had made were holding, but they wouldn't hold forever, and without someone who understood the system, a full breakdown was only a matter of time. He petitioned the Concord for help. The Concord sent a Solhari engineering team. The team arrived, examined the reactor, and spent 2 days running diagnostics. Then the lead engineer called the governor into the control room. "This is a human-designed system," the engineer said. "It uses a modular architecture that is not compatible with standard galactic engineering frameworks. We cannot repair it, we cannot modify it, and we cannot replace it without tearing out the entire power grid and starting from nothing." The governor asked how long that would take. "Years," the engineer said, "if we had the budget, which we don't." The Solhari team left the next morning. Ambassador Rask spent those 3 months pulling every communication record, trade log, and service report he could access. He worked late into the night, cross-referencing data, building timelines, mapping dependencies. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at the ceiling for a very long time. Humanity hadn't just participated in galactic society. They had been the invisible framework holding it together. They ran the patrols that kept the trade lanes safe. They built the systems that kept colonies alive. They mediated the disputes that kept old enemies from killing each other. They shared research that advanced medicine and technology for species that never shared anything in return. And they had done all of it without asking for recognition, without demanding power, without leveraging their contributions for political gain. They had done it because it needed to be done, and because nobody else was willing to do it. Rask closed his files and sat in the dark. He was not a sentimental man, but he felt something that night that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was the slow, creeping awareness that he had been standing in a building his whole life without ever once looking at the foundation. And now the foundation was gone, and the walls were beginning to crack. He drafted a report for the Concord. He titled it simply, "On the Absence of the Human Delegation and Its Consequences." But he sent it anyway, because someone had to start saying out loud what the silence was already screaming. 6 months after humanity stopped showing up, the galaxy began to feel it in its bones. It started with the trade lanes. The outer shipping corridors, the ones that connected the frontier colonies to the core systems, had always been dangerous. Pirate clans, rogue factions, and desperate scavengers had prowled those routes for as long as anyone could remember. But for decades, they had been kept in check by a quiet, persistent human presence. Patrol frigates running regular sweeps, convoy escorts that never missed a schedule, and emergency response ships that appeared so quickly after a distress call that most raiders had learned it wasn't worth the risk. Now those ships were gone. The raiders figured it out fast. Piracy along the outer lanes increased 400% in 6 months. Cargo haulers that had once traveled freely now refused to fly without armed escorts. And there weren't enough escorts to go around. The Concord's own security fleet, which had always relied on humans to do the hard work along the edges while they guarded the comfortable inner systems, was spread so thin that response times tripled. 3 colony worlds formally petitioned the Concord for emergency military protection. They were placed on a waiting list. A waiting list for survival. But the trade lanes were only the beginning. On the far side of the galaxy, in a contested region called the Voroth Corridor, 2 species were remembering why they hated each other. The Tauron and the Jassari had been fighting over the same stretch of territory for over 300 years. It was an old war, the kind that had seeped so deep into both cultures that children grew up learning the names of battles before they learned the names of stars. The fighting had only stopped 20 years ago, and it had stopped for one reason: a human diplomat named Claire Hutton. Claire had spent 6 years living in the Vorath Corridor, traveling back and forth between Tauran and Jassari territory, learning their languages, their histories, their grievances. She had brokered a ceasefire not by offering grand solutions, but by doing something no one else had the patience to do: She listened. She listened to both sides until they felt heard, and then she helped them find the tiny, fragile piece of common ground they could both stand on. The ceasefire had held for 20 years, not because it was perfect, but because Claire had stayed. She had made the Vorath corridor her home. She attended every annual review session. She mediated every border incident. She was the thread that held the whole thing together, and everyone knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. When the withdrawal order came, Claire packed her things and went home to a small house in Vermont that she hadn't seen in years. She didn't want to leave. She had friends on both sides of the corridor, people she cared about deeply. But she understood what the order meant, and she understood why it had been given. Without Claire, the ceasefire lasted exactly 19 days. The first border skirmish was small. A Tauron patrol vessel fired warning shots at a Jasari survey ship. The Jasari responded with a full military deployment. Within a week, the shooting was constant. Within a month, entire colonies were being evacuated. Millions of people, from both species, were displaced, streaming toward Concord space in refugee convoys that the Concord had no plan and no resources to handle. The Galactic Medical Coalition issued a report that it marked as classified, but that leaked within hours. The report stated that without access to human pharmaceutical research databases, progress on a cure for Valine syndrome had stalled completely. Valine syndrome was a degenerative neurological disease that affected 6 different species. Human researchers had been leading the effort to find a cure, sharing their data openly and without restriction. They had been close, within a year or two of a breakthrough, according to the report. Now that research sat in sealed servers on Earth, and the scientists who had been doing the work were reassigned to domestic projects. 6 species, billions of people, a cure that had been within reach, now frozen behind a door that humanity had every right to close. The Concord held an emergency session. The chamber was fuller than it had been in years, and for once, the noise had a different quality. There was no posturing, no grandstanding, there was fear. Ambassador Thylan Rask stood at the central podium and presented his report. He spoke for 40 minutes without interruption, which had never happened before in the history of the Concord. He laid out the numbers, the patrol routes, the engineering projects, the medical research, the diplomatic missions, the disaster relief operations. He showed them the scope of what humanity had been doing, quietly and without thanks, for over 50 years. And then he said the thing that nobody wanted to hear. "We treated them as furniture," Rask said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "We sat in the comfort they built for us, and we never once looked down to see what was holding us up. Now we are standing in an empty room, and we have the nerve to wonder why it feels so cold." The chamber was silent. A delegation was proposed. The idea was simple. Send a group of senior representatives to Earth, open a dialogue, and ask the humans to come back. The vote passed, but only barely. Many species still refused to believe that the situation was as serious as Rask claimed. Others believed it, but were too proud to admit it. Rask led the delegation himself. He chose his companions carefully, representatives from the Drelith, the Rithan, and the Kellis Reach Coalition, species that had been hit hardest by the withdrawal. He wanted the people at the table to be the ones who understood the cost. They sent a formal communication request to Earth through the standard diplomatic channels. The message was carefully worded, respectful, and thorough. It acknowledged the contributions humanity had made. It expressed a desire for renewed engagement. It asked for a meeting. The response came back in 12 hours. It was 4 words long. "We have nothing to discuss." Rask read the message 3 times. He had expected resistance. He had expected conditions, demands, even anger. He had not expected this. This was not a door being slammed. This was a door that had been locked from the inside by someone who had no intention of opening it again. On Earth, Laura Bishop read the Concorde's original request aloud in a small conference room. President Kevin Marsh sat at the head of the table. Audrey Nolan was by the window. General Pete Salinas leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "They want to talk," Laura said. Audrey shook her head slowly. "They want us to come back and do the work. Talking is just the polite version of asking." Kevin looked out the window. It was a clear day. The kind of day where the sky looked impossibly blue, and the world felt very large and very quiet. "They know where we've been for the last 50 years, he said. "They watched us carry their weight, and they said nothing. They watched their governors file complaints against our people for doing the job nobody else would do. They had 50 years to say thank you, or to offer us a real seat at the table, or to treat us like something other than the help." He paused. "They never once asked us to stay. We don't owe them the dignity of an explanation." Laura nodded. She typed the 4-word response herself. Somewhere in Vermont, Claire Hutton sat on her porch and watched the leaves change color. She had heard about the Vorath corridor. She had heard about the fighting, the refugees, the collapse of everything she had spent 6 years building. It hurt in a way she couldn't describe, a deep, hollow ache in her chest that hadn't gone away since the day she left. But she also knew something that the galaxy didn't seem to understand yet. She hadn't held the ceasefire together because she was human. She had held it together because she cared. And caring was not something you could demand from someone. It was not something you could take for granted. It was a gift. And the galaxy had taken that gift, used it up, and never once thought to give anything back. Claire sipped her tea and watched the sun go down behind the mountains, and she wondered how long it would take them to figure that out. 1 year after humanity walked away, the galaxy looked like a house that had been slowly falling apart from the inside, while everyone pretended the roof was fine. The Torhan Jasari War had spread beyond the Vorath corridor. What had started as border skirmishes had grown into a full regional conflict, pulling in neighboring systems that had tried to stay neutral and failed. Refugee ships flooded into Concorde stations by the thousands, families carrying whatever they could fit into cargo holds, children who had never known anything but the sound of gunfire, elders who remembered the ceasefire and wept because they had always known it was too good to last. The Concorde's refugee processing system collapsed within weeks. They had never needed to be, because in the old days, human relief teams would have been on the ground within hours of the first displacement, setting up shelters, distributing food, organizing medical care with the kind of calm efficiency that made it look easy. It had never been easy. It had just looked that way because the people doing it were very, very good at their jobs. Now there was no one to do those jobs, and the Concorde learned for the first time just how hard easy had actually been. On the Rythan colony world of Tessara, the water purification system failed completely on a Tuesday morning. The filters, which Danny Garza could have replaced in an afternoon, had been degrading for months. The Rythan engineers had tried everything: improvised patches, modified components from other systems, even hand-built replacements crafted from local materials. The human systems were elegant and efficient, but they were also specific, built to work in a particular way, with particular parts. And without the people who understood them, they were just metal and silence. 8 million people had to be moved. The evacuation took 3 weeks and was by every measure a disaster. Transport ships were overcrowded. Supply lines broke down. Children got separated from their families. People died. Not many, but enough that every single death felt like an accusation, because every single death was preventable, and everyone knew it. The galactic economy, which had been contracting steadily since the withdrawal, hit a wall. Human-designed software ran the navigation systems on 60% of all commercial freighters. Human communication protocols handled nearly half of all interstellar data traffic. Human algorithms managed the docking schedules at the galaxy's busiest ports. All of these systems had been shared freely, maintained regularly, and updated without charge. Now they were decaying, one line of code at a time, and nobody had the expertise to fix them. The breaking point came at AllHFY Prime itself. The station's docking network, which managed the arrival and departure of hundreds of vessels every day, suffered a cascading software failure. The error started small, a timing glitch in one of the secondary routing algorithms, but it spread through the system like a crack through ice. Within hours, the entire network was down. 614 ships were stranded, unable to dock or depart. The gridlock lasted 11 days. Trade losses were measured in the billions. The Concorde fractured. The Solhari Dominion accused the Kellis Reach Coalition of hoarding emergency food supplies. The Kellis Reach fired back, pointing out that the Solhari had voted against every aid package proposed in the last 6 months. The Draelith threatened to withdraw from the Concorde entirely unless their engineering crisis was addressed. A dozen smaller species, the ones who had always existed in the margins, protected by the informal safety net that humanity had quietly maintained, began to lose faith in the system altogether. For the first time in its history, the Galactic Concorde looked like it might actually break apart. On Earth, Nathan Cole watched it all from the observation deck of a quiet orbital station above the Pacific. He had been reassigned to administrative duties after the Starling was put into refit, and he spent most of his evenings up here, looking at the stars and reading the galactic news feeds that still trickled in through the long-range communication arrays. He didn't feel good about what he saw. He had expected to feel vindicated, and part of him did, but it was a small, bitter part that he wasn't particularly proud of. Tired and sad, and something else that he couldn't quite name. A kind of grief for a version of the galaxy that had never actually existed. A version where people noticed the work you did and said thank you and meant it. Megan came up to the observation deck with 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to him. She didn't say anything for a while. They had served together long enough that silence between them was comfortable, even necessary sometimes. "Do you think they'll figure it out?" Megan asked eventually. Nathan took a sip of his coffee. It was too hot, but he drank it anyway. "They'll figure out what they lost," he said. "Whether they figure out why, that's a different question." Megan nodded. She looked out at the stars the same way he did, with the expression of someone who had seen too much of the galaxy to be impressed by it, but still couldn't help finding it beautiful. "Claire called me yesterday," Megan said. "She's been following the Vorath situation. She's not doing well." Nathan closed his eyes. Claire Hutton had been one of the best people he had ever known. The thought of her sitting alone in Vermont, watching everything she had built fall apart from 12,000 light-years away, made something tighten in his chest. "None of us are doing well," he said. "But we're doing better than we were." Across the galaxy, Ambassador Thylan Rask sat in his office on AllHFY Prime and did something he had never done before in his 32 years of diplomatic service. He wrote a personal letter. Not a diplomatic communique, not an official request, not a carefully worded document reviewed by committees and approved by councils. A letter, written by one person to another person, with no title on the header and no seal at the bottom. He addressed it to Laura Bishop. He wrote about what he had seen in the months since the withdrawal. He wrote about the Rithon water crisis, the Vorath corridor war, the docking failure at AllHFY Prime. He wrote about the fear he saw in the eyes of delegates who had never been afraid before. He wrote about the smaller species who were suffering the most, the ones who had never had a voice in the Concorde, and whose only protection had been the quiet kindness of human crews who stopped to help even when they didn't have to. And then he wrote the part that mattered, He wrote that the galaxy had been wrong. Not in a small way, not in a way that could be fixed with a resolution or a policy change, but in a deep, fundamental way that went to the core of how every species in the Concord had treated humanity from the very beginning. He wrote that humans had been taken for granted, marginalized, exploited, and ignored, and that every species in the galaxy, including his own, bore responsibility for it. He understood that he had no right to ask that. Instead, he asked only one thing: would they be willing to listen? He sent the letter through a private channel, unencrypted, with no classification markings. He wanted it to be just words from one person to another, nothing more. Laura Bishop received the letter at 3 a.m, Earth time. She was still in her office, because she was always in her office these days. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly. Then she read it a third time, and when she was done, she sat very still for a long time. She had read thousands of documents since the withdrawal began. Reports, analyses, intelligence briefings, diplomatic cables. All of them had been about politics and strategy and leverage. This was the first one that had been about truth. She forwarded the letter to President Kevin Marsh with a single line of annotation. This one might be real. He read it the way he read everything, carefully, completely, and without expression. When he was done, he set it down and looked at Laura. "What do you think?" he asked. Laura took a breath. "I think one honest voice in a chamber of 400 is a start. I don't know if it's enough, but I think we should find out." Kevin nodded, very slowly. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He said, "Let me think about it." And for the first time in a year, the door that humanity had closed wasn't locked quite as tightly as it had been the day before. 18 months after humanity left, someone leaked the letter. Nobody ever found out who did it. Rask suspected one of the communication technicians on AllHFY Prime, but he never pursued it, because in the end, the leak did something that 32 years of diplomacy had never managed to do. It told the truth to a galaxy that had been lying to itself for half a century. The letters spread through galactic media like fire through dry grass. Every news service, every independent broadcast, every underground information channel picked it up and ran it in full. Rask's words, raw, unpolished, and completely without political calculation, landed on billions of screens across hundreds of worlds. And for the first time, the conversation changed. It wasn't instant. Nothing real ever is. Prominent voices across the Concord dismissed the letter as emotional weakness, as a Solhari ploy for political advantage, as an exaggeration of humanity's importance. The Drelith government issued a formal statement calling the letter irresponsible and factually misleading. 3 other delegations released similar responses within hours. But beneath the official noise, something quieter was happening. On colony worlds and space stations, in homes and workplaces and crowded refugee shelters, ordinary people were reading the letter and recognizing the truth of it. A Rython mother on Tessera, still living in temporary housing after the water system failure, told a reporter that the only people who had ever come to fix anything on her world had been humans, and that she had never once thanked them. A retired Jasari soldier who remembered Claire Hutton said that she was the only outsider who had ever bothered to learn his language, and that he had never told her how much that meant to him. The stories multiplied. Across the galaxy, people began to remember, not the grand gestures or the political maneuvers, but the small, ordinary moments of human kindness that they had taken for granted. The engineer who stayed late to make sure a system was working properly. The doctor who learned a species biology from scratch because no one else would. The patrol captain who answered a distress call in the middle of a dead zone because leaving someone stranded wasn't something he could live with. The Concord, sensing the shift, did what political bodies always do. It scrambled to get ahead of a wave it couldn't stop. A special session was called. The chamber was standing room only, which hadn't happened since the founding ceremonies decades ago. Ambassador Rask, who had become something of an unwilling hero to half the galaxy and a traitor to the other half, was asked to present a resolution. The resolution was simple in language and enormous in meaning. It formally recognized humanity's historical contributions to galactic stability, commerce, security, and welfare. It acknowledged that those contributions had been systematically undervalued, uncompensated, and taken for granted. And it included an invitation, not a demand, not a summons, not a request wrapped in diplomatic language that really meant come back and do the work again, but a genuine, open-ended invitation for humanity to re-engage with the galactic community on whatever terms they chose. The vote was not unanimous. It was never going to be. But it passed with a margin large enough that even the dissenters understood the chamber had spoken. Rask watched the vote tally with an expression that was difficult to read, or the particular exhaustion of someone who had fought a battle they weren't sure they could win, and had come out the other side, not victorious, but alive. On Earth, the resolution was received with something that an outside observer might have mistaken for indifference, but was actually something much more complicated. The anger had faded a long time ago. What remained was caution, the deep, bone-level caution of people who had been hurt and had learned to protect themselves. President Kevin Marsh called a national discussion. Not a closed-door meeting with advisors, but a real, open conversation that played out across every city and town and orbital station in human space. People talked about it in living rooms and break rooms and on long walks through quiet neighborhoods. They argued and disagreed and sometimes raised their voices, and it was messy and imperfect and exactly what it needed to be. 18 months of peace and reinvestment had been good for Earth. The shipyards were thriving. The research labs were producing breakthroughs at a rate they never had when resources were being funneled outward. Communities that had sent their best people to serve on distant worlds were whole again. There was a real cost to going back, and people felt it. But there was something else, too, a discomfort that settled in the quiet hours. Nathan Cole felt it on his observation deck, watching the stars and knowing there were people out there who needed help. Megan Pratt felt it at her monitoring station, tracking refugee convoys she couldn't assist. Danny Garza felt it in the engine room at Copernicus Station, building beautiful machines that never went anywhere that mattered. Claire Hutton flew to Geneva to testify before the National Commission. She sat in a chair in a large room and spoke in a voice that was steady but carried the weight of everything she had seen and lost. Isolation is not the same thing as dignity, she said. We proved our point. The galaxy heard us. But if we stay behind this wall forever, we become something we're not. We become people who stopped caring, and that is not who we are. It has never been who we are. The room was very quiet when she finished. Laura Bishop worked through 3 drafts of the official response before she was satisfied. She had always been a careful writer, and this document needed to be more than careful. It needed to be precise, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. The response acknowledged the Concord's resolution. It expressed appreciation for the recognition, and it stated clearly that humanity was open to re-engagement. But it came with conditions. Full and equal voting representation in the Galactic Concord, proportional to contributions, not just population. Retroactive recognition of all territorial claims that had been blocked or denied over the previous 5 decades. An immediate end to discriminatory trade and colonization restrictions. The establishment of a mutual accountability framework, binding on all member species, that would prevent any single civilization from being exploited or marginalized again. The conditions were not punitive. They were not designed to humiliate or dominate. They were simply the terms of a relationship between equals, written by people who finally understood their own worth and were no longer willing to accept anything less. Laura sent the document to the Concord, with Kevin Marsh's signature at the bottom. The debate in the Concord chamber lasted 3 days. It was loud and contentious, and at times deeply uncomfortable. Some species balked at the territorial provisions. Others resisted the accountability framework. But Rask, who had spent the last 18 months watching the galaxy learn the hard way what happened when you took good people for granted, stood at the podium and said something that ended the debate. "They are not asking for anything they have not earned," he said. "And they are offering us something we do not deserve. A second chance. I suggest we take it before they change their minds." The conditions were accepted. The vote was decisive. On the day the Starling launched, the sky above Earth was clear. Nathan Cole stood on the bridge in a uniform that felt familiar, but also somehow new, the way old clothes feel after you've changed without realizing it. Megan was at the navigation console, running pre-flight checks with the quiet competence that had kept him alive more times than he could count. Danny was in the engine room, complaining about a calibration setting that he claimed was off by 0.03%, and that nobody else could detect. The crew was smaller than it used to be. Every person on board had volunteered. No one had been ordered to return to galactic service. That had been part of the deal. From now on, every human who served beyond Earth's borders did so because they chose to, not because they were told to. The Starling cleared Earth orbit and turned toward open space. The stars appeared on the main viewport, sharp and bright and impossibly far away. Megan glanced at Nathan. "Think it'll be different this time?" Nathan watched the stars. He thought about the Drealith governor who had filed a complaint instead of saying thank you. He thought about the empty chairs in the Concord chamber. He thought about Claire, sitting on her porch in Vermont, watching the world she had built fall apart from half a galaxy away. He thought about Rask's letter, and the honesty in it, and the hope. "It'll be different because we are," he said. "They can take us seriously, or they can watch us leave again. But this time we walk in knowing exactly what we're worth." The drive engaged. The stars stretched into long, thin lines of light, and the Starling jumped into the void. Behind them, Earth hung in space, blue and green and perfect, the home of a species that had spent 50 years carrying a galaxy on its back without complaint. They had left without anger, without ultimatums, without saying a single word. And in that silence, they had said the only thing that mattered. "We were always here. You just never looked." The galaxy didn't collapse without humanity. It stumbled, it bled, it lost things it could never get back. But it also did something it had never done before. It looked in the mirror and didn't like what it saw. And maybe that was the real gift humanity gave them. Not the engineering or the medicine or the patrols through dangerous space, but the chance to become something better than they were. Whether they would take that chance remained to be seen. But for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy was watching, and this time it was paying attention.